The army, it is in fact most near and most clear to the one who recognizes it as the site of equal footing, where the weak assertion of one's capacity for feeling and reason is replaced by emphatically proper linguistic performance. Again, Fanon is concerned with the narcissism of the new returnee, the social climber, as he links up with Arendt's own stringent analysis of the parvenu. That narcissism disallows a rigorous and requisite full inhabitation of the zone of non-being, an extraordinarily sterile and arid region, an incline stripped bare of every essential from which a genuine new departure can emerge. This incline, or declivity, or ramp, bespeaks, again, the bioalchemical laboratory in which the black is made. What remains in question is whether or not she is present in her own making. How do we speak of that presence, of a real transubstantial presence, in the same breath with which we describe sterility and aridity? What if we choose, while also choosing not to assume the barrenness of the paraontic field? This incline, where experimentation in the interest of securing the normal requires the production and imposition of the pathological, where investigation in the interest of freedom demands incarceration, is or ought to be a site of study. To speak of Pidgin, then, as the language of nothingness or of non-being, the language whose shadow delineates the territory of the inexistent, is not to utter a decree that legitimizes skipping the question concerning the constitution of that language or paralanguage and moving straight to its reduction to the subordination it is supposed to indicate. Three questions emerge. What is Pidgin? Who makes it? What pressure does it place on the very idea of the standard? Isn't such pressure, in fact, the making of the standard? These questions open us onto another understanding of the experiment, which Fanon takes up both literally and figuratively. And this is Fanon again. A moment ago I spoke of narcissism. Indeed, I believe that only a psychoanalytical interpretation of the black problem can lay bare the anomalies of affect that are responsible for the structure of the complex. I shall attempt a complete lysis of this morbid body. I don't know what the proper word would be. I'm so enamored or stricken or infatuated with this term lysis that I just can barely contain myself. You'll probably get sick of it in a little while. In a paragraph that begins by asserting the necessity of psychoanalytic interpretation for revealing the black man's affective disorders or anomalies, we note this movement between consciousness and the unconscious, cut and augmented by commitment to the trajectory of self-consciousness, wherein, quote, the individual should tend to take on the universality inherent in the human condition. Husserl, Hegel, and Freud are present, but in a kind of Sartrean light or frame, beginning with that fateful, fatal interplay between the miraculously self-positing individual and the uncut givenness of the standard. But analysis is then cut by something, a natural process if not attitude, corrosion, compromise of the cell's integrity. We are aiming for a complete lysis of this morbid universe, and I'm going to see how I can see what can be made out of the fact of the conflict between Markman's translation on the one hand, which is just blatantly unliteral, and Philcox's translation on the other, which is literal and therefore kind of blatantly unpoetic, maybe, in a way that I think obscures certain things that we could talk about under the rubric of truth. Right? Markman says complete lysis on this morbid body. More literally, Philcox translated as a complete lysis of this morbid universe. So part of what's at stake is to begin to think how the conflict or the tension between these two translations requires us and allows us to consider what the relationship is between body and universe. Okay. Anyway. We are aiming for a complete lysis of this morbid universe. I shall attempt a complete lysis of this morbid body. The two translations, one in its literalness, the other in its avoidance of the literal in the interest of greater idiomatic precision, allow us to linger in and consider the relation between the universe and the body. See, I just did that thing again. Between the transcendental aesthetic and the body that it makes possible, and that makes it possible. It is as if both are, each in their morbidity, to be submitted to a radical breakdown. The language of biochemistry permeates Fanon's text, as it should. The language of biochemistry is all bound up with the language of friendship, the massive corollary problematic of like and unlike, rending the distinction between friend and enemy that Plato gets to in Lysis. Lysis, which is, right, Plato's dialogue called Lysis, right, which is really an attempt, this amazing dialogue, which is an attempt to try to delineate and to define what friendship is. And by the end, it just kind of collapses and sort of turns on itself. No conclusion is arrived at, right? Okay. One way to think about it is that it instantiates and also at the same time could be said to perpetuate something like what one might call an interminable analysis, right? The dialogue kind of can't come to a conclusion. Okay. So I have to make clear when I'm talking about Lysis, the dialogue, and when I'm talking about Lysis, this biochemical process that essentially is how Lysis describes a breakdown of the cell, right, and of the cell's walls, which occurs in the context of an illness. But what Lysis also is it becomes a kind of tool and part of the protocol of the biochemist who is interested in replicating the conditions of the disease precisely in order to be able to understand it and to provide some sort of cure, right? So it's a classic example of what Derrida talks about under the rubric of pharmacon, right? The cure that is also part of, that is also the disease or poison, okay? You know, because right, y'all know that what people in medical experimentation have to do first and foremost is to replicate the disease that they're trying to cure. Okay? So this is this sort of field of experimentation that we're sort of trying to work through. Lysis, I guess I'm doing it, sorry. Lysis, well, anyway. Lysis is to separate, to break down walls, to refute, but also to redeem. The pursuit of the meaning of friendship moves by way of bondage. This is a quote from Plato, by the road which skirts the outside of the wall, end quote. Thinking on or over the edge of the city, there is, quote, a palestra that has lately been erected. We made a space, we formed a pit, here, where, there, where, in the very place of resistance, says Derrida, right? It's like that kind of cool way when you're reading Plato and you just realize that this is, that against the grain of his most sort of restrictive and regulatory philosophical impulses, there is also just this constant sense of Socrates as just this kind of raggedy, dirty old man on the edge of town, because that's the safe place where you go to try to think about shit. You know, in a place which, and precisely as a function of its politicality, right, is desperately concerned with the regulation of thought, right? So, and what's cool is like you can go and like try to think about stuff and just gaze longingly at young boys at the same time, right? So, that's why, I mean, I'm just indulging myself in this notion of Socrates as a kind